Conversation podcast. Discussion, interviews, reviews, and rants. Military science station podcast.
Hey, welcome back to the show. Today we are doing a follow-up to our in-depth kind of high concept plotting show where we went through, you have just received basically a new contract for a military science fiction series, typically a trilogy, and walking through how we would develop the concept and then the summary for that story. And today we're going to talk about how you take that summary, which could be anywhere from, a 10,000 to a 20,000 word document. I have explored this is a lot of people ask me, you say that you write, hey, I write novels, and they just look at you sometimes like you say, like, I build airliners, and what they don't realize is that if just like building a very complex anything, a jet, it's all about a small series of steps, right? And if you know what those steps are and you know where you want to get and you know how much you need to do every day and you're on a path to get there, and once you've done it, you will get there. You will build the table, you will make the nice thing that you want to make. It's not as hard as you think, but we only have so much time. So doing it in a way that you know where you're going, you know what you need to write, at least for all of us, I think we're on the same sheet of music. So somebody here, correct me if you're what they call a pantser, a person who just like writes, as it feels good and goes back and fixes it. I've certainly done that in my life, but I've learned that I only have so much time, and it's much better for me if I know what I want to write. Like I can write a lot if I know what I'm going to write.
My
But
original superhero series were pantsed, like
mhm.
all 14 of them completely pantsed,
My
but
first
they were
six
easy.
novels were pantsed.
And how did that go?
Um,
You finished them.
Took a long time to write them.
Yeah.
But I will say, and this is kind of, contradicting what we're talking about, but it was a lot more fun. And plotting is
Faster
more
too.
plotting is more efficient. You get it done faster. Sometimes it's more coherent, but it was a lot more fun pantsing. It was like it's like writing the story and watching it play out in front of your eyes, like somebody else is telling it to you.
Part of the
I
logical appeal to pantsing is the dopamine hit from writing it, and part of the downside of plotting things is once you've plotted it out, you know the story already, and so you're not like you don't have the thrill of discovery of like where is this going,
Right.
my when I first decided probably back in 2011, 2012 to take writing seriously and actually try to finish something because I've been writing stories on one level or another since I was like 14 years old. So, well, the better part of 30 years. And I'd never actually finished anything, and I'd never actually really kind of sat down and thought about what I wanted to do. And the first thing I wrote when I decided to do that, I pantsed. And I had kind of a vague idea of where I wanted to go. And I got about 55,000 words into it and had no idea what to do when I got to that point. I had an idea about the ending, but I didn't know how to get from where I was at to the ending. And I actually found that I wrote a lot of stuff that didn't matter. It was just kind of, walking in a field, navel gazing kind of stuff. And after that, I started working on the second story that I planned out from kind of beginning to end, but very loosely. And then my process kind of refined from there, and I became every book that I have written, I've become more of a detailed plotter uh, than the last. And now I can't even. I mean, maybe if I wrote like a short story, I could write like a sentence of this is what happens and then kind of go from there because it doesn't cover the span of 100,000 words and I can just knock it out. But if I'm going to write a novel and I'm going to take the time to write a novel, I want to know that I'm not wasting my time. And of course, I say that, but Weaponized, the first draft has been done for over a year and a half. And I've edited it and rewritten it and cut it and recut it and rewritten the ending. And now I'm rewriting the beginning. And there's just so many things that You find kind of as you go through the completed book that you're like, this sucks and this doesn't work and I've got to change this. So
When a book is done, it's done.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, the more you learn, the harder it gets, right?
for one, and that's part of the problem too. Like Rick's saying, is that just kind of the sheer enjoyment of doing the discovery writing is awesome. But now that I've been doing this for 10 years, a lot of that time professionally and full time, I'm very self-critical, and I know that if I see the problem and I know that it's a problem, I have to fix the problem instead of being blissfully ignorant, like what's his name in The Matrix, and he would just wants to get loaded back in. Um, so yeah, sometimes having all that uh, structure knowledge and story knowledge kind of works against you almost.
So if you're a pantser, I would say just take this as and put it in the back of your mind as things you might want to think about as you're struggling with your 10th rewrite. Um, but
I'll tell real quick, James. I'll tell
yeah,
you what made me go from being a pantser to a plotter was that it was really easy to hold one character or maybe 5 characters in my head in a story
mhm.
written in first person. Super easy, 60, 70,000 words, no problem. But to hold 8 characters with all their, different aspirations and needs and wants, story arcs, a plot, a thread, a plot that was more complicated than just there's a bad guy, I have to smash him. It is impossible to do a 100,000 word novel like that and have it come out coherent. And I knew that's where I needed to be. So as I was pantsing those superhero novels, I was working toward figuring out how to plot it. And it wasn't until I did the snowflake method that I read the book, The Snowflake Method, that I actually figured out how to a plotting system that worked for me.
I also feel it's a bit of a false dichotomy when people say it's either or because at the scene level and once you kind of get the roadmap out, like I feel like even, you're still coming up with those things in the moment as you decide how to get from A to B, right? Like that has to be created. And I find that there's still a lot of that same dopamine hit in writing a chapter I'm really happy with, or a dialogue I'm happy with. I just know where I'm going as I'm doing it. So,
I would I would say that the it's not impossible to it's hard, but it's not impossible to juggle those characters in those settings when you're pantsing. It just takes longer. That's the real failing. I mean, I actually had more subplots and more POV characters when I pants than now when I plot. But it took a long time sitting there getting myself into the head of whatever POV character was in this chapter or in this scene. Um, and that was the fun part too. I wrote I would write in my third person novels because half of them were first, half of them were third. But in the third person ones, I would write like scenes told from a POV of a throwaway character just to give the reader an idea of what the protagonists look like from the outside. Not from each other who they all know each other, and they've been working together. This civilian or this, local cop or whatever sees this military team come in and is awed at like their precision and everything. But when they're with each other, they're like joking around and just taking things for granted. I always thought that was a cool little touch, but when you plot something out, you don't put that in as much. You tend to stick more to what's necessary to the advancement of the storyline.
yeah.
Well, I agree, and actually, I've over the last 2 years, I've read as kind of a genre study, almost predominantly thrillers, and one of the things that I've learned from that is like jumping right into the action, and that's changed a lot of how I think of jumping into the action. And like going through these rewrites on Weaponized, I realized that I had pretty much 2 chapters of buildup till the event that happened that is what I want to happen. And I thought in my mind, oh, I need to set context and introduce characters and all of that. And I can, but I can do that very quickly. and I don't have to spend pages and pages and words trying to set context. Well, the way I write anyway. So in terms of the opening sequence, I had the main character starting on a ship. Then they get on a drop ship, and then the next chapter they're dropping in these combat pods, and then the next chapter they're walking through the town, and then the next
Spoiler!
chapter yeah, and then the next chapter they get ambushed. And so I took all five of those chapters and condensed them into basically two, and really ramped it up and got into the action a lot faster. Which I'm gonna try to go forward with outlining, but with outlining, I usually find that I have to outline a lot shorter than I think I need the outline. And like I've mentioned before on the show, I try to, if I'm writing a book, I go, all right, 100,000 words is my plan. And then I've got to stack all these scenes and outline all this stuff. Well, I'll be like, here's a scene right here, and that's going to take me 2 chapters. Well, in reality, that scene turns into like 6 chapters. And so what I had planned in my structure for 100,000 words actually turns into like 170,000 words. And I'm like, oh, okay, I don't need all the rest of this stuff. And so going forward, I'm really gonna try to stick to the main sequences and then narrow down those. But you talked about like how you take it from your outline to your draft, and that has changed a lot for me as well. And the one thing I've found recently is instead of taking my outline, and like I said, sometimes my outlines are 10,000 words, sometimes they're shorter. And then just looking at that beat and writing the entire chapter out in narrative prose the way you may read it, I've decided to take kind of it's not quite the snowflake method, but it's basically I take that beat and then just write out very quickly in abrupt things. He goes here, he sees this, he does this, he does this, he jumps over a car, he goes here, and then go back in and like draw it out.
Mhm.
And that helps me because when I go through that scene and I'm looking at those brief points, I can see it in my head, and I know what they're doing, but it's not in full color on the page. And then I can go and see the problems in the scene without having to waste an hour writing 2,000 words and then realize that that doesn't work. I can just very quickly kind of pinpoint or keyframe, if you will, different things, and then go back and completely write it out once I know it works. And so that's what I'm going to do going forward with the second half of the weaponized book, and then the third, once I get the outlines done, just go through and punch out those just really quick narrative points in the chapter and then flush it out after that. So I'm not wasting a lot of time figuring out that it doesn't work after I'm done writing it.
One note, we keep mentioning the snowflake method, which Jeff, can you help me with the author? So it's oh, he's got it right at hand. There it is.
I'm coughing a lot, so I had to mute it. It's Randy Inger Manson. I think I'm saying that Inger Manson. And this is his How to Write a Dynamic Scene sequel to the Snowflake Method, which is how to write a dynamic novel using the Snowflake Method. And essentially, like the real basics of it is you start with a sentence and then you start expanding.
Mhm.
And every time you expand, you expand more. And it's very structure based, and I really like it. And I would like to have him on the show at one point. And he's agreed to come on the show at one point to talk about it, which I think would be really cool.
Yeah, I think
But it's told through the book is basically a narratively written novel, and the person who is the main character of the novel is learning how to plot a story from the Big Bad Wolf.
right.
Cool.
Yeah, and I think even if as a reader you might find this interesting because it would help you. I think just appreciate when somebody does it well. It's always like even if you're not a writer, sometimes books like that can be just help you appreciate something where somebody did it, really well and had. I think that book in particular helps you have just a really clear through line on what the story is all the way.
My big thing about stories is that things happen for a reason in a story. If there's no reason for something to happen, it doesn't belong in the story. And we had a discussion on our Discord about tropes, which is a word I hate. We've had discussions about structure and plotting and stuff like that.
What is the
But it all
trope
comes
where a
down
writer
to
always hates tropes?
That's like the
the
misery.
King.
the writer hates trope.
Yeah.
But what it comes down to is structure is designed to give a story a form, and you can put anything you want in that structure. But without it, you end up with stories that don't make a lot of sense because they're all over the place. I'm sure they made sense in the author's head, but they have to make sense in the reader's head.
Right.
Right.
So
I think that's one of the things that I really struggle with my writing sometimes is a lot of times I forget that the reader doesn't know what I know. And so I write a scene out and then, a couple of weeks later or a couple of months later, I'll go back and reread it, trying to do it without any context or any basis around what's going on. And I think that's the kind of the
The hell did I mean
baseline
here?
theory behind putting your manuscript away for a couple of months and then going back and reading it because you're not in it. But I'll go back and read a scene and I'm like, I don't understand this, or this doesn't line up with what happened before, or something like that. And I struggle with the white room syndrome. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but it's basically where you're writing a scene and maybe you have two characters talking and they go back and forth, but the entire time you can't see where the characters are. Like, for instance, you couldn't see the bridge if they're standing on the bridge, or you couldn't see the subway car or whatever it is. And so I try my best to not have white room syndrome in as very little words as possible. And usually I just seed those through the scene. But again, that comes after I've got the bones of the sequence laid out.
right. So we've talked about, and I think one of the things Josh mentioned that I wanted to touch on was those beats. So you've done your, like for me, I think about, okay, what are the really cool things I want to get to, like the real high points of the story. But as we set up, we talked about, okay, your average military science fiction novel has 80 to 100,000 words. So if we're thinking about 50 chapters that are an average of 2,000 words apiece, each of those chapters might have 3 scenes in it if we're going to get really granular and anal about it. So now you've got, we talk about form, like Jeff mentioned, you've got like kind of very specific places where you maybe need to do certain things. And, Rick, I think you talked about liking the 3 act structure, but can you maybe touch on how you take that summary and then fit it in? Like, first off, do you just make a list? Do you use Excel? Like, what do you do to break down what's going to happen in
I
those
do my
chapters?
best to never use Excel in my life ever.
You're a blessed
It's,
man.
it's hard enough to use Word intelligently. Okay, this is harder to explain now that I'm like working on my 80th novel than it was back when, when I had to think about it. Because at this point, when I come up with a plot, it just automatically falls into a 3 act structure because I'm so used to doing that. But thinking back to when I first started plotting, you get a feeling very quickly, not just from writing, but from reading, when an act has gone on too long. And even when you're doing an outline, if you're doing an outline and you get to, say, chapter 15 or 16, and you're still on the same general plot point, it feels too long, and it is. You gets depending on how long your book is. But for me, the longer the book, the more I would consider doing something other than 3 act structure, because you get to a point in a plot arc when the reader knows, and you will feel as a writer, that you've belabored this too long. You have to move on to the next section of the book. It's hard to describe that in like quantifiable terms, but the first part of the book is setup. And when you're watching a movie, if the movie takes too long for the setup, you start looking at your watch and saying, let's get to the story. I've had enough setup. I know who these people are. I don't need every single detail of their life. I just want to get on with the plot. and the readers are going to feel that way. And if you have read enough books, you will feel that way. And let me stress something that there is no replacement for as a writer. You cannot shortcut around this. To be a good writer, you have to have read a lot of books in your genre. And you need to have read the books that are generally considered the best books in your genre. And if you don't, then you may be able to use shortcuts and, writing books and things like that to put together something coherent that looks good, but you're never going to get a feel for it. You're never going to be able to do it without looking at your notes, sort of, unless you have read a lot in your genre. So when you're plotting, when you're trying to fit things into a 3 or 5 act structure, make sure you've read, say it's science fiction, say you're writing military science fiction, since that's what we're talking about. Make sure you've read like Niven and Pornell and Heinlein and John Ringo and David Weber. So you can get a feel for when does the setup stop? When does the middle begin? When does the climax start? When's a good, you can get to the point where you don't have to like count your words or your chapters and think, oh, have I gone on too long? You'll just know, because this is, when you get to too much setup, it's going to feel like, okay, this is dragging. What's wrong? What's wrong? You should have moved on.
I couldn't agree more. The one of the things that boggles my mind is I'll be talking to other authors and I'll be, not you guys obviously, be like, well, where's your
guys? You're the best.
And they're like, well, I don't have any weak points. I'm like, okay, well, go back and read some books, and then you can tell me, be honest with me and tell me what your weak points are, because we all have our weak spots. We all have our blind spots when it comes to writing. And one of the things that I use my outlining for is to make sure I highlight my blind spots and try to work through them. Because if you're not getting better with each book, what are you doing? Why even bothering?
Right.
I wish, and this is going to sound stupid, but I wish I was a romance author who could just crank out the same novel with different characters over and over and over again and make 7 figures,
Right.
It's why I'm on book 8 of Grimm's War, and it's getting harder and harder to write each book, because I've got these great characters, I've got this great universe. Each book needs to be better, and each book needs to have an interesting plot, an interesting story, and interesting things happening in it. I can't just recycle a storyline from 3 books ago. Not that necessarily romance authors do that. I know they work hard, but from my perspective, that's what it looks like.
Well,
And
romance is a good example of even what you guys are talking about. Like, romance readers are especially attuned to, if something doesn't happen by the first, I don't know all the steps, but the meet cute, the reversal, the build up, the blah blah blah, the run through the rain. Like, if all that stuff doesn't happen at a specific time, then they don't make it. And if they hit it, that's the book that will make them millions of dollars. So
when you write military science fiction and you get into book 8, book 9, whatever, you're also running into a problem that I don't think other series run into as much, is you're writing about people who are in a war,
right.
And you have to make things exciting. You have to have action every book. But
people gonna die.
But realistically, people are going to die. And beyond that, there is only so much combat a person can take before they start to lose, they lose their coherence. They start to, PTSD is a thing, and it doesn't take much to start it. And if you get somebody who's been in combat, 20 times over the course of 9 books, that's going to start to eat at them, and you're going to have to deal with that, unless you just want to make it a comic book, Star Wars movie where nobody ever thinks about that.
Also, don't go the other direction too and make it Hunger Games, where by the time the 3rd book happened, Katniss was just a blithering idiot, drugged out of her mind, stuffed in a closet until they needed her because she couldn't handle the stress. Because that's not how it works either. That's
well, and different warfighters handle battle stress differently, and some characters will become kind of crippled by their experiences. Others kind of feed on it, and you look at the difference between kind of the mental perspective of like maybe a drafty grunt infantry guy and a Navy SEAL. They're going to have two different experiences when it comes to combat. And like Rick said, you take those two people and you put them into 20 combat scenarios. The grunt could get some kind of debilitating PTSD from it, and the
Well,
SEAL
let me say,
maybe
you may
he
not get
has.
debilitating PTSD, but you will get something, no matter if you're
Well, I'm
hiding
just
it or
like
not.
I'm
You're
kind
gonna
of
have to
using
deal
it
with
as like
it.
a
Yeah.
hyperbolic argument, but
I just mean
you
you
know,
got to deal with. You don't have to make them like
right,
crippled, but you have to mention it. You have to
for
say,
sure.
yeah, this I
To be honest,
I had to go to the battalion shrink, and have the long talk with her, or some.
Right.
If you have that much, combat in a war that everybody sees, it's gonna get to you.
there's a thing too about telling a story, and bear in mind, we're storytellers here, right? We're not videographers, or we're not biographers, we're not documentarians.
Hmm.
Telling a story, stories need to be fun and interesting and not boring.
True.
And one of the things that I know all of you guys are familiar with, when you handle things that you don't necessarily want to focus on in a story, you mention it once or twice, and then you can move
Yeah.
on. I've got a character like in the second book who dealt with some PTSD over something that really bad happened to her in the first book. And I've got a character in book 5 who dealt with some PTSD. And those characters act as a gateway for the other characters. You can
Right.
assume if one character is dealing with it, all the characters are dealing with it. I
Right.
don't need to watch them go to the bathroom.
Right.
Yeah. But
I've touched on it.
for instance, in I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but in one of the Drop Trooper books, you have the main character who handles it very well because his entire life has basically been one traumatic experience after another, and he's learned to deal with it. And then you have some kid who's who's one of his new recruits who's having a hard time with it, and you can use that as like a contrast between how one character deals with it,
Right.
like the hardened guy like Josh was talking about, versus some drafty grunt who got taken out from his family, and had never done anything before, and now is in the middle of a war.
And there's a place in a story to handle that. And it's not in chapter 1, because whatever you do in chapter 1 is what the story's about.
Yeah.
And it's not in the last chapter either. You got an entire second act for these kinds of little subplots. And that's where they belong. Because everything you mentioned in the first 10 chapters is what the
How to
book
make
is
the
about.
mushy middle not so mushy.
Right. James, you were talking about, well, we've all kind of been talking about not making it boring and kind of the structure of the story or whatever. One of my favorite examples of this is the movie The Last Starfighter. I'm sure you guys have seen that, right?
Of course.
And there's very clear, if you think about it in terms of what they're doing with their story, there's very clear stages of progression through that story where you have a setup. He's a guy in a trailer park. You have the training almost in one where he's playing that video game and he's really good. Then you have the introduction of this is real. There's another world out there and there's aliens. And then he's made that decision. I don't want to do this. And then you have
Answers
this
the
big
call.
inciting incident.
Mhm.
Well, he doesn't. He goes home. He wants to go home.
Well, yeah, you deny
and
the
then,
call and then you answer. I mean,
Refusing the call.
it's also
Yeah.
classic. I'm blanking.
Hero
Hero's
journey.
journey.
Hero's journey.
Yeah, hero's journey.
Yeah,
There you
yeah, yeah. And then you have the decision to come back, and then you have the kind of the secondary turn where he's the only one left. And then you have the big battle, and there's very clear stages where you can see that progression go through, and they leave out a lot of the kind of boring in between stuff. You don't get an explanation on the cubes with the money and the guy that is really, I don't know, he's kind of a weird dude, and you get a little bit of character with Centauri and everything else, but as far as like the backstory and all this other stuff and the huge world building that you may see in a novel, you really just get the high points, and
You
so
save
if you're
that stuff
looking
for
at
the sequel, because that's when people are really going to want to
100%.
know it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I would love to see of all the remakes coming out. I would
Oh, it's
absolutely
not a
love to
remake.
see Last Star. I know it's a sequel, but I would just love them to, because the
I
Last
just want them to
Starfighter,
take The Last Starfighter and redo all the special effects.
Yeah.
right, 100%. That's what I'm saying. Like, make it really, really cool because
Like they
for
did
the
with the
time, the
the
special,
original Star Trek series. You seen those where they
Mhm.
went back and just redid the special
We
effects?
got him. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
That's awesome. Do that.
Well, at the time, those special effects were cutting edge and they
I
were
know.
amazing.
I've got it
Uh,
in Blu-ray before they updated the special effects, and you can just so many things jump out at you as just being like styrofoam or
oh,
some
for
guy messing
sure.
with a thing in the corridor that's obviously he's not doing anything. It
I
it
can't
has
remember
extra
if it
layers.
was it last week when we were talking to Steve and he was talking about the progression of technology, and I
Mhm.
said we went from a computer that fit into a huge building to one that sits on your lap now. But one of the things that I think is crazy is that we go from, like, when I was a kid playing GoldenEye on the N64 and thinking these were the most amazing graphics, cutting edge, like I am there, this is so realistic. And now we're looking at like stuff in Unreal Engine 5 and you compare the two and you're
Right.
like, that it's like a stick figure
On the other
almost.
side of that is looking at movies like Aliens or Jurassic Park with mostly practical effects, and now with all the CGI and green screen makes it look like a cartoon.
Mhm.
Right.
Part of that, and it's funny that this, I'm going to bring this back around to novels. Part of that is, and video games, is this game came out recently called Avowed, and whether you like it or you hate it, it is objectively 25 years old in technology. I mean, there are side by sides where you can see them putting Skyrim next to Avowed, and Skyrim is more advanced and it came out in 2011.
Avowed,
And
AVOWED.
AVOWED. It
Okay.
was from Obsidian. It was supposed to be their big RPG, and it just is. It looks like crud. And my
I
son
haven't
asked
heard
me,
of it.
he
Okay.
was an aspiring game designer. He's like, why did they do this? They had to have played Skyrim. Well, first of all, they probably never did play Skyrim. And second of all, they did the best that they could do. They're just not very good at their job. If they could have made it better, they would have. The people making movies where everything is gray and the CGI is all blotchy and looks like a cartoon, they would have done a better job if they could have. If you read a crappy novel, that was the best work somebody could do. And so every book has to be the best that you can do so that you can get better. Otherwise, you write these crappy, blotchy cartoon of a novel that someone looks at and goes, "Oh, I read a better book than this 30 years ago." Which is why it's also really important to have read in your genre. So you're not there's a feeling you get when you're reading a book where you feel like, oh, this person thought that this was an original idea because they're treating it like it's so special. And there are no original ideas. Just get that as a writer, get that out of your head. There's only the way that you tell a story. That's the only original thing about a story is how you tell it. And if you've never read anybody else's work, then you're not going to have your own way of telling a story. You're going to have the exact same way of telling a story that everyone else who's never told a story before tells a story. You can
The
tell
only
a new
thing
author because they make the same good decisions and bad decisions as every other new author.
The only thing I would caution in as far as what Rick said about reading, Highline and Ringo and Weber and all those guys, read those guys for sure, but also read new stuff. Read stuff in the
Yeah.
last 5 or 10 years
Josh doesn't read
because
any of those guys.
I have read Weber. Thank you very much, and I'm pretty sure I've read one Ringo book, if I remember correctly. But the story style and narrative style of those books from 20, 30 years ago to now are extremely different in terms of how they read. And some might say that the first uh, Honor Harrington book compared to something now is not good. I would not say that, but if if you're watching Endgame and then you go watch the original Tron, if you're not looking for the story, you're like, this sucks. It's just a whole bunch of neon lights and some gray screen and all of that. But if you're looking at the story, then like I love Tron and I will still watch Tron regardless of how crappy the effects were. But you definitely, if you're writing today, you want to have a good baseline for what is popular and selling today.
Absolutely.
Also with the knowledge of what the authors did, 20 or 30 years ago in terms of story and structure, so that you can have both of those in your mind, because you can do a really good blend of both. But it
I
is
don't
a
know
good
that
idea to have.
I don't know that I mean there's certain things that have changed since those people wrote, but I don't know that the story structure has changed that much. In there's
Well,
there's
not
Story
in
things
structure
terms
like
of
hasn't
like,
changed.
there's
not in
things
terms of
like
the bones, but the presentation of that
I mean, it's
structure
things like
has.
nowadays people want some kind of conflict or action early in the novel, like in the first couple chapters, and that wasn't a thing before. But as
You
far
had a
as
lot more leeway
yeah,
in the day and back in the day to do that setup.
I
I
disagree.
think
I don't think I've ever read a good novel that didn't have a hook in the first chapter. Starship Troopers opens with Johnny doing a drop. Basilisk Station opens almost immediately with her doing the training exercise that goes so poorly.
right.
Good novels open with a hook, and it's been that
a
way.
hook, but not necessarily action.
You don't have to open with action. You have to open with tension.
With tension, right? But
You know,
in the military
Intrigue.
science
I
fiction,
modern
say
authors
intrigue.
take that to mean action. There must be something going on, like someone must be shooting or whatever. But really, all it is tension. You have to open with
Right.
tension.
I mean, I would say in a military science fiction story, I mean, I'm thinking from an army perspective, but like movement to contact. Like movement to contact is an action that is full of tension, depending on what it is, but it might not have direct action with the enemy. But if you can be in what the characters are doing, you can, you can show their competency. That's similar to to a drop for like a space marine, where you can see their
Right.
competency, but also, I mean, for me, a drop also has a little bit of that, like, I don't know what's going to happen. I could randomly die, but I'm also a professional. So I don't, but you establish some things about what kind of story this is going into it. And one of the things, like, I know, in Drop Trooper, Rick did this quite often, where if there was like a slower, what might have been seen as a slower part of the story, like we're not in active combat, oftentimes you put in a training mission and might even start that point not knowing that it's right away it's training. And then I mean, you didn't play that trick very often that I'm remembering, where you wouldn't know that it was training until the end. Like typically, okay, we're in a lane, this is happening. But that can be a way to get that tension in there without specifically having tension happening or action happening, I guess. But that's I find that hard. That for me, that's one of the places I'm really trying to improve, especially in the thing I'm writing on right now, which is, kind of based in Afghanistan. And one of the things that was sucked about Afghanistan was you didn't always know what was going to happen. Like you randomly people shoot at you, or you go conduct movement to contact or patrol. You might get attacked, you might not. You might randomly. So I mean, it's hard to do that narratively and have, if you're focused on reality or whatever reality, it's not as exciting as fiction should be, right? So that can be hard to like maintain that tension without having the action right in there.
One
So
of the things that I've kind of gravitated to now in terms of like writing action sequence or combat sequences, and is that um, in previous works I always tried to make it as clear as possible, like the action as clear as possible, even if the character didn't have a clear understanding of what was going on. And what I mean by that is, you have the camera way up here, and so you know that there's a tank coming over here, and you can see this, and you have all of that information, even though the character doesn't. And what I've started to do now, and what I find really interesting, is instead of laying all that out in a paragraph of description during the battle sequence, um, doing it very clipped, and almost like first person directive, where you're I mean, obviously if you're writing first person, you're in the character's head. I write third limited, so it's basically in the character's head. I'm just using he and she instead of I. um but in a sequence I wrote yesterday, where before I would write, a sound came through from the distance coming from the left, and all of this stuff, right? And in the sequence I have now, it was just shots rang out, and he turned toward the shots and moved,
bring it closer.
instead
Yeah.
of like, instead of doing that stage direction where you're like, the shots came from the left and so he had to turn to his left and run down. You can really pare that down into just really clipped I also don't use like he grabbed it with his right hand unless it made sense to say that. Or, I have
Don't
a
say did
sequence.
anything with left or right unless you have something in mind for the other hand that
Right.
he is to be doing.
100%. Yeah. I had the part of the sequence is they're running down this really narrow kind of alley pathway through these two buildings. And previously, I would have written the character got to the end of the alley, took a knee, and then leaned up against the right hand building wall, right? Like really making it clear that's where he's at. But in this context, all I did was he got to the alley, took a knee, pressed himself against the wall.
Right.
So
All
it
you
does,
need.
because honestly, it doesn't really matter where he's at. The reader can make that determination and see it however they see it. And as long as you follow through with the action, in terms of getting just very minimal direction and all of that, then I think those scenes work really, really well, and it can really pare the words down in terms of like total words written.
Too much
One of the
detail can
things that
confuse the reader.
one of the things
Yeah.
that is really difficult for newer writers, and everybody suffers from this. So I'm not like banging on newer writers, but everybody suffers from this. Is that you're seeing a movie playing in your head, and you're trying to write that movie. And
Yeah.
what you need to be doing is you need to be feeling a story in your heart and relaying that story to somebody, because the movie is never going to happen. And trying to make someone see what you're seeing is just going to confuse them. You got to be
One of the
vague.
things that one of the things that Stephen King says on writing, which you take his writing advice for what you will, but one of the things he said that I really have taken to heart is um, the writer and the reader kind of have this telepathic connection to the same scene, but they see it two completely different ways. So once you understand that no matter how detailed and descriptive you are in your book, the reader is never going to see it the same way that you do. Um, Unless you're talking about like Jeff, the Interceptor, you have a picture of the Interceptor on your cover. So when we talk about the Interceptor, you can see this is what it is, right? But
But
if
they
you
still
didn't
have
have
their own idea of
right,
what,
like ship
even though it's on the
interior,
cover.
corridors, all that, they all see it differently. And so you don't have to get into the nitty-gritty of three pipes ran along the right hand of the ceiling and there was two cables hanging down with sparks coming out. You could just write pipes along the ceiling. And it doesn't matter the way you see it because the reader's going to see it and they're going to enjoy that scene.
One of the hardest lessons I had to learn, and I tell people this all the time, is when you're new at writing, and by new I mean like probably your first 10 books, you're going to want to be specific when you should be vague. And you're
Yeah.
going to want to be vague when you should be specific. And you just need to flip that switch in your head. And you need to realize there are things that you need to be specific on, but 90% of the stuff you just need to be vague.
In my
And
opinion, one of the
use
things
that
that
to it.
new writers are way too specific on is personal appearance of people.
Right.
There's
And
details
we're
you
all
don't need-
guilty of that.
I mean, there's details you don't need to know.
100%.
You can say he was a little man with a soft face and let them do the rest. You don't have to
Right.
say
He was a little
he was
man
five-
with a pencil mustache and brown hair that went down to his eyebrow, and you know.
But no, I see new writers all the time. Like he was 5'6" and about 135 pounds, and
Talking about weeds, stop using about or maybe. For
Right.
the love. It's
I
either
think we're getting a little
130
bit far
meters or
afield
it's
from
not.
plotting, though.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
Can I-
no,
can
but
I-
this is a great. This is
Yeah.
a great discussion because I think about this stuff all the time. And honestly, since we are talking about mill sci-fi, you look at our genre in terms of what Rick's saying, and you're like, yes, you can keep those things, unless you're pointing out a specific character trait. Like for instance, if your character's black or they're Asian or whatever it is, then you can point that out and say,
I don't even say that stuff. I don't think they need to know unless it's part of the plot. I don't even mention skin tone or anything because you can say in their name. Maybe if they're Asian, it'll sound like an Asian name.
for sure.
But I
Yeah,
don't.
but
I don't
there are
mention-
certain genres that you read that are that go the other way, and those readers like that. So, for instance, if you're reading epic fantasy and you've got that 2 or 3 paragraph description of the orc
True.
king that's sitting on the thing, that is necessary to that genre.
Skip past, skip
Yeah,
dialogue.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, something's
But for
happening.
our genre, for our genre, if you go into an orc king, all you got to say is the orc king, and
Right.
if you want to, maybe even say he was a shade of emerald or a color or something like that. But if you
Unless
say
he's wearing
orc king,
powered
people are
armor,
gonna,
then you can
yes, an
describe the
orc
powered
king
armor.
in powered armor, and then that's really all you need.
And if you're
Because
describing an alien, you're most of us are writing. I think all four of us are writing in close third POV or first, one or the other. So what you're going to be describing isn't a like a technical scientific description of an alien. It's the first thing that comes to mind to the person looking at it. So I'll say like the thing looked like a cross between a rhinoceros beetle and a scorpion. And that's all you got to say. You don't have to give a detailed explanation of what it looks like. Just what
Right.
the initial impression of that guy
Yeah.
is.
They're not biologists.
I
But
do.
I would like to
Right.
I would like to get to, since we're dealing with separating it into acts, I would like to get to the hardest part of writing a novel, whether it's military science fiction, the mushy middle. You know, getting past the middle of your story when you're plotting it out. I find that for me, when I first started out, and for probably most people who are starting out, doing interesting stuff in the middle is the hardest part. Filling it with something that is worth reading. How do
yeah,
you guys handle that?
You guys mind if I answer this real quick?
no,
This
go
is
ahead.
something that got me for a long time until I realized that I was thinking of
I
my
love the middle, so go ahead. Yeah,
yeah until realized I was thinking of my stories in the wrong way. I'm very linear. I have very linear thought process, and one of the things that held me back for a long time in my stories was I present my protagonist, I present the story problem, and my protagonist would proceed to solve the story problem until it was solved, and that was at about 60,000 words. In reality, that was the middle of the book, not the end. Because at that point, the protagonist should have realized everything that they were trying to do was wrong, and it
Right.
was actually this other thing that they
Midpoint
needed.
reversal.
Yeah. And so when I'm writing a book now, when I'm plotting a book or writing a book, I am writing toward goals. The first act is to get to the first plot point, which is the first reversal. The second act is to get to the second plot point, which is the second reversal, and so on and so forth. And what happened was is for instance, in Against All Odds, spoiler alert, Jacob arrives and takes command of the Interceptor, and his entire goal is getting the ship running. And it's not stopping pirates or, stopping the corrupt system government, or, saving the merchants. It's just getting the ship running. And then he does that, and then this other thing presents itself, and that becomes the goal. And those are the plot points. And I mean, I used to struggle with that second act so bad because I was like, okay, well, I know how the story's going to end, and I know how the story's going to begin. What do I do in the middle to make it interesting? And it was actually Rebecca who helped me figure this out. My wife helped me figure this out. And it made my stories so much more interesting because you'd get to the middle and you'd have the reversal, the classic reversal. And you can read a book and it can say, hey, the second plot point's the reversal. But there is knowing something, and then there is knowing something. And that's the big difference. So that's what I do is
And
write
that's a
story in
place
the
where a
middle.
lot of times the reader, you can tell the author might just be following the plot as opposed to doing what the characters would do. So I think that's really difficult to have a reversal that makes sense for the characters, that your character isn't stupid, or that they're not stupid. Or like in the case of this, like Jacob has been focused on fixing the interceptor, and then things open up, and now we have other things we have to fix. And there have been other plot points along the way with Zuckerbar and what's happening there within the system that, if I think I'm remembering the plot correctly there, that okay, now this wasn't the problem. Like you solved the problem, but now it's time to level up and
Yeah, I mean, like they find the grav coil to fix the ship, and in doing so, they find the human trafficking.
right.
Then they're trying to defend the human traffickers, they find the pirates, and so on and so forth. And so basically, it's like these layers, and you keep peeling them back. You solve one problem, a new problem presents itself, and you have to resolve that. And you can do that in a very disjointed way. When we've all read and watched those stories where it feels like you're watching a 2-hour anthology, here's 3 different stories. or you can do it in a way that makes sense as just before you resolve one issue, a new issue presents itself, but not in a way that like Lost did it, where there's this thing called the
Oh,
mystery
there's polar
box
bears now.
where
Okay.
you never
Yeah.
resolve the story.
Right.
You just get
Right.
a new problem, right before you solve that one. So now that one's not important anymore. No, you got to get a new story, resolve the plot point, move forward. You cannot leave things
Yeah.
unresolved.
So Rick, how do you approach this now? What have you learned over time?
Well, I don't. What Jeff said sounds good and sounds like it would work, but it's not how I wound up doing it. Um, maybe that was a failing. Maybe I kind of backed into it because I started out as a pantser and only
We
later
brought
on.
it full circle. That's why we talked about
Yeah.
pantsing.
Yeah. But for me, when I was a pantser, the way I would do it was I would do what I would call a false start myself and let the characters go through that false start. And then, as Jeff was saying, you find out that what you were trying to do isn't going to solve the problem, and you find out the real way to solve the problem. But as I'm plotting, an outline, as I turned into an outliner, I should say, rather than have like, I don't think I would call it a reversal all the time. A lot of times I will have complications is more the way I would put it. You start out the book with the main character, the protagonist, with one goal in mind, as he said. But when they get to the second act of the book, everything gets more complicated. They find out to reach their goal, they're going to have to do a lot more than they said they would, or that the enemy knows what they're trying to do, and they have a setback. I guess setback is the word I would use, probably. Things become a lot harder. They reach setbacks, they have to restart, they have to.
I mean, that's all plot points are.
Yeah.
It's
They,
all
they,
plot points are.
and
Yeah.
then you, by the end of the middle act, you get to the point where you know what you actually have to do, and now it's just a question of doing it and paying the price.
Right. That's a good point.
If one of the best books I've ever read for structure is called Screenplay by Sid Field. And yeah, it's about screenwriting, but it's based on the hero's journey. And in this, I'm gonna get so much heat for this. And the only actual storytelling structure, which is the 3-act structure. Everything else that people talk about is just they've taken one act of the 3-act structure and they've broke it down into other things. Dan Harmon's story circle is just a reskin of the hero's journey with less parts. And I never understood people's fascination with that, because I'm like watching it because, everybody talks about Dan Harmon's story circle and he did, Community, and I gotta figure this out. And I'm like, this is the hero's
He did
journey.
Rick and
I've
Morty
read
too.
this book.
Yeah.
So read Screenplay for story structure. Again, it's just structure. It's not story, and it doesn't make your story feel like anybody else's story. What it does do is make it so that you can tell a story that people will understand, because it's the way humans have been telling the stories for 8,000 years. If you read Gilgamesh, not in the original Klingon, you'll find that it follows the hero's journey. And if your story follows the hero's journey, your characters will be real to people and they'll feel them. But you can do anything you want in that structure. And that's what the 3-act structure and the hero's journey work so well together, because that's actually the way we're programmed to understand stories. And I'll preface this, in the West.
Right. Right.
Gilgamesh wasn't in the West.
Well, it was
Technically,
the
was.
tradition came. I
Western
mean, you could say the
civilization.
Iliad and the Odyssey. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know the connections there. It's hard to
We
connect.
say-
I would
Western
say,
civilization is starts in Sumeria,
yeah.
and includes Egypt. I mean, I know that's like weird for some people to grasp, but all that's Western civilization, because Western civilization is built on the ideas that came out of those regions.
Hey, what's the
So-
oldest novel? The Tale of Genji. I'll have to look up if there's elements of
Gilgamesh
that
was the
journey in
oldest
there.
story.
Well, it's a narrative poem, right? But then novel, like what's considered a novel, I think. I mean, I don't know. This is what I just remember from school.
Oh,
that-
the one that was written in 200 BC.
It's a Japanese, like it basically is like court intrigue through time or something. I don't know. I had to take a class on it and
Does
didn't
it
really
have a
read it.
different structure?
That's what I'm
Yeah,
wondering. Like, I
because
wonder if there are elements.
Eastern stories are based on ideas,
Mhm.
not on resolutions. So that's why I have such a hard time watching anime. Is a lot of anime is just let's explore this idea for 18 episodes and then do nothing with it because we're just exploring an idea. Wouldn't it be cool if this kid could control people telepathically and he could call down laser beams from the sky? Let's spend an hour and a half and call it Akira and then not have any kind
Favorite
of
one recently was the Demon Lord that works at McDonald's. I watched that one. Okay, so I think we'll come back to how to fit
We're gonna
all.
have to do a whole thing on middle because I love the
obviously
middle.
we have a lot to say
Right.
about this. Let's do a whole episode on the middle.
And we're kind of
We'll
backing
call it the mushy
into
middle
how,
and everything.
yeah, how we fit all this into
Malcolm in the
chapters.
middle, whatever.
And because only a couple of you watch until the very end, don't forget to like and subscribe because I keep forgetting to mention that in the beginning, even though I do have the bell coming up. We get about 75% of our viewers are return viewers. So if you're not subscribed and you're watching, please do. It really helps out. We're building this channel. It's
You don't subscribe, it'll make Jeff cry.
it'll make my deaf son so sad.
Oh, don't
You don't want my
don't bring
deaf
Gideon
son
into this.
sad.
He has nothing to do with our marketing.
I
All
will
right.
point out, and then just for your guys' point of view, I can look on YouTube and see when we mention people subscribing or when the icon pops up, and there's always one person who likes or subscribes at that point. So,
And we appreciate
We
you. We're
appreciate
not
it,
dogging
yes.
on that.
Whoever
So
Oh,
that
you know what we
post
should
is,
do?
thank you.
we should do a competition, and like people should put their names in the comments, and then we can put them in our books if they've liked and subscribed.
Or
I
maybe
like that.
maybe we could have a competition to give away a signed copy of one of our books to them.
Sure, but only if you
Yeah,
watch. You won't know about it unless you watch all the way to the end of the
I
video.
know, all the way to the end. And let
We'll
us
give
know
them a
what kind
secret
of
word.
what kind of contest you would like.
The word of the hour is weaponized.
Weaponized.
Yeah, I like that. I like that.
All right. Well, thanks for hanging out with us, and we will see you next time. So check us out in the Discord, the Facebook, and like Jeff said, like and subscribe and stuff. Tell somebody about the show. That would be awesome. All right. We'll see you next time. Thanks.